we can dive right in, and that'll be helpful. I want to look with you at Acts 15 quickly. Acts 15, if you'll recall, is that moment in church history, early church history, where the church leaders had to get together and talk about the phenomenon of change happening around them. And you'll remember that that this involved people from different segments of the church that was emerging at the time, but the church was primarily a Jewish community at that time. And the problem that they were facing was what are we going to do with all these Gentiles who are suddenly now becoming followers of Jesus, and it was creating some discomfort in that setting, in that group, and so they had to have this big conversation about that. And there were some, as you'll recall, had the idea that, well, the Gentiles can come in and do this as long as they become Jews first, and as long as they become, as long as they participate in the practices of Judaism, they're welcome to be part of the church. And others were saying that's not necessary. We shouldn't do this because God is accepting them just as they are. And so there was this big controversy about what to do with the Gentiles. And the conundrum was, how do we absorb them and how do we recognize them? And the testimony of Paul and even Peter, who was, probably identified as the camp of the Jews, indicated that God had received the Gentiles who expressed faith in Jesus in exactly the same way as he had the Jews. And so there was kind of no argument about that. It was like, well, yes. And that's why it's important to know as we did the last time we were in this subject, in the last class, we talked about how the Holy Spirit came in exactly the same way to these different cultural groups, so that there would be no mistake that they were equally accepted by God. And so what we discover in Acts 15 is this idea that some people were clinging to the religious identity of Judaism as the primary foundation for the community of Christ followers, and they were still practicing much of what was part of Judaism as they knew it. I mean, there wasn't any reason not to do that. They just continued in that. But the Gentiles, of course, having no history in that, didn't know how to do that and didn't practice those things, and were just kind of like happy to be part of the party, And so what they discovered is that it was really the cultural markers of Judaism as a cultural expression that was preventing the fellowship that was supposed to be happening there. And so they came to that decision after much prayer and discernment and conversation, and then they decided, well, the only thing that's keeping us apart is these cultural things. So if the Gentiles will make these concessions, then we will make these concessions, and then we can move forward together. And so even though it wasn't a perfect agreement, it was a sufficient agreement to keep the church emerging and growing and so forth. But the point that I want to draw from this just for the moment is the idea that the practices of Judaism as a religion were very, very compelling, to that community, and they let go of them. They didn't willingly let go of them, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is they were very, very constraining, but also very comforting. And, it'd be like saying, okay, you can no longer be American. You have to be this, and it's like, well, does that mean we can still do this or whatever? It's like giving up a part of your identity. And the Jews had to realize that there was this sense that the practices of Judaism were getting in the way of what God was actually doing. And that was a big surprise, I think, to them, because why would you think that? You wouldn't think that. But that's what they came to. And that's something we have to bear in mind, especially as we think about how is the church forming now? And are there things in the way we practice who we are that are actually getting in the way of what God may be doing in this time? And we have to at least be open to that possibility. We don't have to say, well, of course it is, and let's just go slash and burn the things we don't like about church. That's not the idea. The idea is just to be open, to hold those things like loosely, and to say, well, I'm willing to continue to be in the body of Christ and to follow Christ, but I'm also not clinging to some of the things that I think are necessarily important, especially if they're not. But we don't often know what those are. We just don't. We acquire these things. We absorb them, and then we don't even know they're part of us until it gets pointed out, usually by outsiders or newcomers, who see things with fresh, vision. And so forth. This morning was really interesting. I was reading a column from a British 20-something Christian. Remember last week we talked about how strange it was to watch the Queen's funeral and see just how deeply religious the sermon was. And you would think on that basis that England was this great paragon of religious virtue, and of course we all know that's not at all true. But this guy was writing this column. He was a 22-year-old British university student, and he's writing about religion and the religious kind of preferences of students and people of his generation. And he writes as a Christian, but he doesn't advertise that fact. What he said was that interestingly enough, the trappings of religion are actually keeping people from understanding what Jesus is trying to say as the way to live our life, and that by clinging to these religious practices is actually getting in the way of the message of Jesus. So it's a little bit like on that graph we talked about there, the liturgical piece where you didn't have to hold the deep convictions of faith. You could question some of those things as long as you did everything correctly with the host, and I mean the Eucharist and all of that. You did all of that correctly. You could kind of question some of the cardinal beliefs of faith. And he was illustrating the fact in his writing that that's what 20-something people in Britain are actually just bored with, is that piece of it, the religious piece of it. They're actually very open to the teaching of Jesus if you can get there. But most of the time they can't get there because the structure of religion as it's understood in Great Britain is actually preventing them from hearing that message. I thought that was interesting. And so the idea is that religion sometimes gets in the way of what God is trying to do. And I think that's where we want to head today is as we begin to discuss Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because so I was hoping you were going to go with Dietrich this morning, but you went with C.S. Lewis instead.
I don't know how to spell Dietrich.
Yeah,
C.S. Lewis is a lot easier.
It's D. Bonhoeffer. That's how you do that. D. Bonhoeffer. So so what we discovered in our time that Don didn't include was the pattern of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. That's what we discovered as a regular historical pattern, and that there is sometimes a disruption to convention that then opens up new opportunities and new horizons and so forth. So that's what Bonhoeffer discovers in his life, because there's a huge disruption in Bonhoeffer's life, obviously, and that causes him to question everything he's understood about faith and what the future of faith might be. And so for the benefit of our tape and so forth, I'm using materials from this book by Jeffrey Pugh called Religionless Christianity, Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Troubled Times. That doesn't mean everything that he's writing in there is what I'm using, but I'm using some ideas from that text to inform our conversation. Bonhoeffer lived from 1906 to 1945 in Germany, and he experienced this pattern of orientation, disorientation, and he didn't get to the reorientation. He saw it and he hoped for it, but he didn't live long enough to enter into it. So he experienced the disruption of convention, but never got to enjoy the new vista and new horizon. Although interestingly, he could have. There was a time in his history, and we don't want to spend a long time on this, but he actually came to the United States during all this lead up to National Socialism in Germany, and they in the United States, his friends there, saw the peril that was coming and encouraged him to stay in the United States during that time, and he was tempted by that, and certainly would be an opportunity, but he said, if I don't go back and go through the struggle with them, then I will have no authority and no credibility to participate in the rebuilding. And so he went there just so that he could go through that and then be credible in the restoration, but he never got there. On the other hand, as Teresa reminded me this morning, Moltmann, Jürgen Moltmann.
Don't know how to spell that either.
Yeah. It's just J. Moltmann. Okay. So, Jürgen Moltmann was also alive during this time. He's still alive, and he was captured early in the war, prisoner of war, in Great Britain. And from his experience, instead of going into quantum physics, which was where his mind was leading, he ended up with questions of theology. And he turned out to be this amazing theologian after the war who develops the theology of hope, which is probably influenced a little bit by the same kind of thing that C.S. Lewis is talking about. But so Moltmann does become part of this reconstruction and what Bonhoeffer hoped to be, but never got there. So Bonhoeffer's primarily known for his book, The Cost of Discipleship, and that's based on the Sermon on the Mount, and it's a really interesting book. And if you've not read it, you probably should. It's an interesting, it's not easy reading, but it is important reading. And he talks about this idea of cheap grace in the book, which is a very interesting concept to consider and to see the evidence for. But Bonhoeffer writes this book, The Cost of Discipleship, because he comes to believe that the Sermon on the Mount is the foundational piece of who Jesus was and is and continues to be in all of history. So that's the foundation for any life of following Jesus for him. And he was active in what was called the confessional church as opposed to the German church. And so if you know this history, then you know that the German church was that which kind of got absorbed into the political structure of that day. And the confessional church was kind of like the outsiders who are saying, no, let's not do that. That's a problem. And so Bonhoeffer was part of the confessional church, and he created a seminary that tried to live out the Sermon on the Mount. as its major curricular piece, and they did that in community and practice, and they got so good at it that the government shut them down, and so that was a problem. He was very public about his opposition to the power structure of Nazi Germany as it was beginning to form. He spoke out against it in public. He warned about the tendencies and the trends that was beginning to develop, and he was very courageous in the things that he was saying about that as it was just beginning to appear. Unfortunately, his voice didn't gain the audience that it needed to have in order to stem the growth of all of that, and pretty soon that structure became more powerful than what Bonhoeffer was able to speak to and speak against, and they began to control when he could speak and couldn't and how and all of that, and so it became problematic for him to be very vocal in society, in his society at that time.
Would you mind, isn't it the Barmen Declaration, which is part of our book of Confessions that was actually written by members of, I believe, the Confessional Church?
So I was on point 4.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Point 5 is the Barmen Declaration was written during this time.
I'll be quiet.
But include that in your...
I'd just like us to all know when we look at our book of Confessions, there's something
in there about that. Yeah, it was actually written by Karl Barth. He's a Swiss theologian, and it was very, very strong in denouncing any authority over the lordship of Jesus Christ. So if you want to read, that declaration, it's a very powerful declaration, and it is very specific to that moment. And it helps. No, thank you for bringing that up. I want to make sure you include this in the summary for next week. Yeah. So the Barmen Declaration, though, is an illustration of how confessions operate in the church, because confessions come along to explain the church's self-understanding at moments of great turmoil or so forth. And so the Barmen Declaration is an instance of that, where the church got together, the German church, and actually just a few elements of the German church got together to make this statement about who the church is in the face of the growing threat of Nazi Germany. And so it's interesting that the Barmen Declaration continues, and the authoritarianism that it was speaking against didn't. And but it is an important document to read. Bonhoeffer eventually, we're skipping over a lot of history, but he eventually got caught up into a group that had attempted to assassinate Hitler as a means of stemming the evil that was coming from there, and so Bonhoeffer was guilty by association. I don't think Bonhoeffer was a principal in that group in terms of saying, yeah, let's go kill him. That's not what he... but there was a conflict in his own life. And you have to be honest with that he came to this place of saying, is it a greater evil to allow this to continue or to end it in whatever fashion is available to you? And he decided that it was better to do this than to allow this to continue. But I don't think he was a principal in there. But nevertheless, he was part of that group. He was arrested and imprisoned as part of that. And then he was executed just weeks before the end of the war on Hitler's direct order. And so we don't have any post-war writings. But he was profoundly disappointed and disillusioned with the failure of the institutional church. And we see that in his writing from prison and the kinds of things that he began to think about. And in prison, he began to ponder the direction of Christianity in the face of what he called the world coming of age. And that was an important topic to him, that began to germinate in him. The world coming of age. And what that means is humankind's coming of age and the attendant religionless ness of humanity. So the absence of religion in a humanity that had no need for God to order its affairs. That was his understanding of the world coming of age. A humanity that had no need for God to order its affairs. And the key question for Bonhoeffer in the midst of all this, and here's what will carry us through in the next couple of weeks. What shape does Christ take in the world? That was the question that he began to think through, and what he was pondering as the focus of his writing and thought after the war. That's what he wanted to explore. What shape does Christ take in the world? And of course, he's speaking about the church in that, because his understanding, of course, is that the church is the body of Christ present in the world, manifesting the presence of Christ and the character of Christ and so forth. So what shape does Christ take in the world? Because the shape that Christ took, or at least the shape of the church during this time of great conflict, became very, very problematic and weak and ineffective and wasn't at all what Bonhoeffer envisioned it to be. And so he suggested a way forward from all of this crisis by defining this new term or this new understanding, and he called it religionless Christianity. And that's a scary term if you just say it out of context. You know?
And that's the criticism of what he saw, not what he was wanting us to become, right?
He's wanting us to become this.
The religionless Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay, because of what the negative port of religion as it was at that time. Okay.
That's what we're going to explore over the next couple of weeks, is what does he mean by that? And what is religionless Christianity? And it's not as scary as it sounds, but it sounds scary. Because if you just take it at face value out of context, then you think, well, wait a minute, everything that's comfortable to me and that kind of defines who I am seems to be what he's against. And so we have to take some time and explore what he means by that in order to consider the possibility that there might be something there. So which one did we discover worked?
I think both of those are okay.
Both of these are okay?
They're not, I've got others that's correct.
Okay. So Bonhoeffer, so we'll just, so Bonhoeffer does religionless Christianity. And another guy that you might not have heard of, but okay. So Karl Rahner, he's a Catholic theologian, also German. So some of our best and worst ideas come from German theology. So Karl Rahner, as a Catholic theologian, he comes up with something similar. And he calls his anonymous Christians. And what he means by this is a little bit different than what Bonhoeffer means by religionless Christianity. But there is room for both of these things to coexist and to have a certain expression in terms of what it means to follow God in the world. And so we're not going to spend any time on Karl Rahner, but I'm simply to say that the Catholics have also been thinking about this idea. There's not just the Protestants. Now, the Catholics weren't thinking about this during the war. You know, they were kind of silent during the war, World War II. But Rahner kind of develops his understanding of anonymous Christians from the standpoint that religion has lost its grip on humanity, and so he's looking for ways that people actually live out what Jesus was teaching without really knowing that it was Jesus who initiated that. And so that's where he comes up with this idea of anonymous Christians. They discover themselves to be Christian, although they don't really realize that that's what it is. And in Ronner's sense, that will be the big surprise on Judgment Day for some of these people. And he suggests that some of those people are the Matthew 25 people, you know. Like, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see, you know? Well, you were living out everything that God wants to have happen. You just didn't know that that's what it was. And so they suddenly discover that they had it right. They just didn't know it. And so there are some theological issues with that, you know. But then if we're open to being more Eastern in our theology, and we're comfortable with mystery, then we can just say, well, God can do whatever God wants to do in these kinds of things. And it's not our place to make those kinds of determinations. But I just wanted to point out that Bonhoeffer isn't the only one who's thought about ideas like this. That others think about them as well, and that there is fruitful thought in that. And that we should pay attention to what that might be saying to us in our place and time. Bonhoeffer saw the church in his time as captured by religion. And that's the problem that Bonhoeffer was facing, is his church was captured by religion. And the definition there for religion, the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power. That's the key term, the controlling power, the superhuman controlling power, especially a personal God or gods, a personal set of institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. So basically, we're going to adopt these ideas, these approaches, these practices that define who we are in light of our understanding of this supernatural controlling power. So this is religion. The only difference between religion and magic in those definitions is what? Who controls what? In religion, if it's the superhuman controlling, that's religion. If it's people controlling power or controlling the superhuman thing, then that's magic. Okay? And that's why a lot of people confuse Christianity with magic. So, because it's like, well, you're just manipulating the God, yes.
Are you using magic in a non-supernatural way, or as an illusion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the popular understanding of religion as magic is just that we're kind of like the sorcerer's apprentice. We're manipulating forces we don't understand completely, but by having these, it's like Simon, the magician in Acts. You know, how much money do I need to pay you so that I can invoke the Holy Spirit like you guys do? and that's the idea of magic as religion. But that's aside from what we want to do. The idea of religion is just a set kind of place, idea, practices, and so forth in view of this superhuman controlling power. And so for Bonhoeffer, the idea was that the forms of religious practice had replaced the substance of true faith. And so as long as one did the practices, one was okay. And so the actual truth of the gospel didn't matter so much. As long as one did the practices of faith, you were a good Christian. There are other people who have interesting observations the same way. One scholar I was reading just the other day said the sad fact of contemporary Christianity is that you have a lot of people who believe things they don't practice. They will quote the Bible backwards and forwards, but they don't practice that. It's not part of their faith. And they're actually scared to. Because if God actually did show up, it would be frightening. It would be terrifying to them. And he didn't mean that in a pejorative sense. He just there was just a reality thing. People quote these passages, but they don't know. His point was Psalm 23 wasn't written as just something we could read at funerals. If you lived Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I have no needs at all. He takes care of me all the time. Leads me into green pastures. Interesting that they should say that, because I don't know if you've ever seen pastures in Israel. They're not green. I mean, I haven't been there personally, but I've seen depictions of it and so forth. It's pretty barren. So to say, leads me into green pastures, what does that speak of? Abundance, and lavishness. So the Lord leads me into the green pastures. I'm beside the still waters. And He refreshes what?
My soul.
My soul. How many people in faith today need to have their souls refreshed? People are almost as frantic as followers of Jesus as people who are not followers of Jesus. Just as frantic, and they need refreshment. Their souls to be refreshed in all of that. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will what? But what do people do? They fear evil. But because they don't have this sense of the living presence, the living dynamic presence of God sustaining them in the life that God has given them. There's not that sense of intimacy with God. Now, I'm not saying this as a criticism per se. I'm just saying this as this is the reality that some people unfortunately settle for in the life of faith. And so rather than quoting all these things, this scholar is saying, let's just live into those things, and then you will find all the comfort and all the delight and all the meaning for which you hope in the world. But so this is what Bonhoeffer is seeing, that the religious practice had replaced the substance of true faith. Just do these things and you'll be all right. And I read this sad report of a church in Germany during this time of the war, where the train tracks that led to the concentration camps went right behind their property. And they knew what was happening when the trains went by. And when the trains went by, they simply sang louder to drown out the sound of the trains going by, so that they wouldn't have to think about what was happening in that moment. That's sad. That's very sad. So either fear is taking over at that moment, or denial is happening at that moment. And if we just sing louder, then we don't have to deal with what we're hearing. And that is a way some people deal with these things. But there's the idea that Bonhoeffer is identifying. So this captivity of the church to religion in Bonhoeffer's time didn't prevent the church, or it didn't prevent or even stand in opposition to the reality of what was happening in that society at that time. It was powerless there. They had kind of caved on their idea. They were more interested in survival than they were in embodying the presence of God in the world, and that's an issue. They were more interested in self-preservation. How can we stay as who we are, than embodying the presence of God. So his main concern and what he began to think about in this idea was how to speak of God in a world come of age. And what does that mean for the life of the church and its existence for others rather than itself? See, he saw the church as largely involved in living for its own existence, self-existence. So you can begin to see how this isn't just confined to his time. Some of those things continue and are happening in our time as well. We live in the age that Bonhoeffer saw on the horizon of the world coming of age. He saw the seeds of that in his time. And had he lived, he would have explored that, with a little more specificity and concentration. But we live in the world that he saw. We live in a world come of age. We don't live with the same tensions that he experienced yet. We don't have those same issues going on. But we live in a world that seemingly has no need of God to order its affairs. That would be the last place we would turn to think about. So in many ways, we continue to practice faith in ways that assume the opposite. We still live with this idea that the world is still desiring God in some sense, and that we have the answer to that for them if they would simply pay attention. And so, in some ways, and here when I'm talking about the church, I'm talking about the church, capital C, not small c like our congregation, but the church as a whole seems to be adopting the world's mindset of rising to power in order to effect a vision for life that preserves the form of the church that's familiar and welcome to them, as the public mind increasingly kind of considers the church unnecessary and irrelevant. So if we can't win them with winsomeness, then we will force them into living out our vision for life. And so there are some elements of the church even today that are beginning to cave into that idea. So I don't mean to get into this at all as part of our conversation, because I'm more interested in the life of the local congregation. But I just want to raise awareness of this Christian nationalism that is kind of developing life in our country, and this would probably be the kind of thing that Bonhoeffer would warn against. To say this is going the wrong direction, because the kinds of things that the church as a whole is embracing in that are the kinds of things that aren't actually embodying Christ's presence. They are more reflecting the internal desires of individuals rather than the body of Christ. And I say that in a general sense. There are certainly people within that wouldn't hold that. Just like there are people part of a lot of other faith expressions that don't understand the roots of that either. They just want to know God, and so they're in that place to know God. There are certainly people within that movement that wouldn't be characterized in a negative way. They just don't understand all of that. But the question remains, what shape does Christ take in the world? That's the question we have to continue to wrestle with. And so we want to do that in the course of our time together. And so we'll come back to this Jerusalem Council idea. A paradigm shift seems to be occurring. And so what changes should we be open to as this shift occurs? There must be a choir thing going on, right?
I think so.
'Cause I couldn't be offending this many people so quickly.
I'm about to get up, but keep going.
I know the subject can get controversial. This can.
I'm sorry, I've distracted you a couple times. But as I've considered all this stuff, two thoughts come to my mind. One is the criticism of the religious church, their cozying up to government to gain power and acceptance, is that part of the criticism that we also call caving in? But I'm forgetting their names, early 30s or 40s, Reinhold and his brother that starts with an R2 had this huge debate about what is the purpose of the church? Should it be getting involved in political issues or should it not?
I think you're referring to Reinhold Niebuhr.
Yes,
Yeah.
Niebuhr, right.
Yeah.
And so is that part of the criticism or misunderstanding of these church organizations that are...
Well, Niebuhr wrote an interesting book called Christ and Culture. And his premise on there was that there are, I can't remember, he says 4 or 5 different stances that the church understands about that. So it's either Christ against culture, so that's one stance that you can take, or Christ redeeming culture, or Christ absorbed by culture, or Christ coexisting with culture. And I think there's one more. The end result was he wasn't making a recommendation on any one of those positions. He was simply saying these are the stances that are present in our society, and these are the reasons why churches act sometimes the way they do. And I think there might have been a bit of criticism in some of those, particularly the church absorbed by culture. They were basically saying the church is just disappearing into culture. But it also comes with the recognition, and missionaries will attest to this idea, is that culture forms the church. I mean, culture does form church, and we have to recognize that. And and that was, again, back to Jerusalem, to the council, that's what they were wrestling with, is, well, how much of the culture should we accept in terms of what it means to be a Christ follower? And the Jewish contingent said, well, this culture prevails. And that's what, they were calling it religion, but it was really culture. Their cultural understanding is what prevailed because they were the ones in power. But now these people were saying, but that's not our culture. And so what they eventually came to was that God had determined you could be a Christian in your own culture. And so the church took on a different form, in this culture than it did over here. And their end thing was, that I think is personified in Galatians chapter 1 when or I don't know if it's the first chapter, but it's in Galatians where Paul relates his going to speak with Peter and the other apostles and so forth. And the end of that visit he had there was that they were examining his theology, so to speak, and because he wasn't part of them, and so they, he wanted to come and say, I think I'm on the right track, and they wanted to say, yes, we endorse you. But at the end it was, they agreed that Peter should go to the Jews and that he should go to the Gentiles because he was, obviously more open to and understanding of that and whatever it was. And so they kind of endorsed a separate but equal kind of thing. We'll do our thing with the Jews, you do your thing with the Gentiles, and we'll both kind of meet once a year. And
recognizing, though, that God is acting in 2 different paths.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, they were affirming that God was doing that, but they recognized that there were different expressions of the church, and so that was just that moment in time. I think it especially when the Gentiles became the dominant culture in the church, then it really changed, and so forth. But that always happens. The culture always shapes the church, and there's a book I read some time ago about mission work and how it was sometimes mistaken or taken over by political ideas and colonialism and so forth. But they talked about early Methodists in the 1800s or early 1900s going to Africa and building church buildings that looked just like church buildings in Michigan, with the slanted roof for the snow load and all that stuff in the middle of Africa. And all enclosed in a few windows and so forth, because that's church, And so all these people would file into church and just sweat their brains out during service because that's just not culturally appropriate. But that was Christianity, right? So the people meeting under the big spreading tree who could experience the breezes and the coolness and all that stuff, even though you sang hymns, that wasn't church. Because it didn't happen inside the little steeple building and so forth. Well, what was that? That was the culture. That was the Michigan culture, or Midwest, or whatever the American culture at that time, importing its cultural understanding of Christianity to a different culture and saying, this is what you must be. And thankfully, missionaries have been disabused of that by now, and they're looking for how do we live as Christians within this culture. That's the whole point. But it's taken us a while to get there, and it always happens. And so we're kind of at that place now in our culture. What does it mean to be the church when the forms of what our church has been? We have to decide: has that been a cultural understanding of Christianity? Is that a dynamic of conviction? Is that the Holy Spirit at work? Or are we in the midst of a new culture and have to be a new church in the middle of that? That's what we're looking for. So maybe then Bonhoeffer's vision of religionless Christianity can help us, in that regard by guiding us to consider a new shape for the church in the world come of age. Where we understand that this church that has brought us to this place was fine for that, but it may not be fine for what's developing now. And we have to be open to that and welcoming to that. All right. So what questions does that raise? What discomfort does that raise for you? Does that resonate? With you in any way?
Questions?
Yes, sir.
You've been standing in front of those two terms all this last 20 minutes, and I'm still puzzled. You have on your left shoulder anonymous Christian. You have in your right shoulder religionless Christianity. Did you say Bonhoeffer wrote against religionless Christianity?
No.
While Karl Rahner wrote for?
Both of them are promoting these ideas. Bonhoeffer is promoting religionless Christianity.
Is that the best term for that?
It's his term. That's why we're using it.
Was he using the tradition? What if it was traditionless Christianity?
Well, that might be a way.
Be a better
That-
way to understand
well,
it?
that-
It's hard to imagine pushing and promoting religionless Christianity. It just seems an oxymoron.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It does.
I think part of the value is when you hear a word like, or a term like religionless Christianity, it makes you listen up because, that's shocking. That sounds borderline heretical right there.
Yeah, yes. Let's whisper that term.
But, when you understand the concept of it, where it's, the fundamentals of what's meant behind Jesus' teaching and not all the cultural baggage that comes along with that.
Yes.
It means you end up with kind of the policy without the implementation of it. So you can have church that's every bit as meaningful as that Michigan steep roof building out in the middle of like Senegal or whatever,
Yeah.
underneath the giant tree.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same, it's every bit as much church, but it's not tied to potentially incompatible cultural differences.
Yes, that's exactly right. I love that. I love that. Thanks for bringing that up, because that's, I think, exactly what he's getting at. Is that?
Rephrase that for the tape.
No, I think he did a good job of
The
it.
tape wouldn't have picked that up.
Oh, well then it needs. You need to read.
I can try saying that
You need
again.
to say it again.
Basically, what I said was that the term religionless Christianity is kind of scandalous, and it makes you listen up really close, because when someone goes out and says that, you in your head think, well, that just might be a little bit heretical there, but on closer investigation, you end up seeing that it's kind of a way to strip away all the cultural stuff, that's the cultural baggage that's not really necessary to the gospel, and get at really the important part, so that you can have a Christian church that follows the teachings of Jesus anywhere in the world, regardless of culture, so that, and the analogy I used was you can have that steeply roofed building with the steeple in Michigan, and that's a valid church, and you can have the gathering underneath the tree in Senegal, and that's a valid church, and they're both equally valid churches, but they don't have the sort of cultural incompatibilities that a stuffy, hot building would have in, say, Senegal.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Jason, I'm so proud of you. I can even do it twice.
That was well done.
I didn't say a word.
That was.
But he's your spawn. And by the way, we do have 2 of those, so if we want to, I could fire them up when we know we're going to have a question session, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think we should always have those available because, the idea is we just wanted to lay some foundation for this because we're going to spend a couple of weeks on this topic of religionless Christianity to kind of unpack what it is that Bonhoeffer means by this, or what we think Bonhoeffer might have meant by this because he never got the chance to really explore that and write about it. So these are people, and even this guy who wrote this book is just speculating on this might be where Bonhoeffer was going with this because we don't really have Bonhoeffer's complete thought on that. We have some thoughts, and then we'll explore some of that. But it is largely along those lines of stripping what has come to be perhaps a more cultural expression of Christianity, of the baggage that it has acquired, so that we can distill it down to the teachings of Jesus and find in that the way of life that Jesus recommended. And then when we live that out, we discover that we actually probably don't need some of that formation, although some of it is pleasant and it's okay, and we can hang on to it as long as we recognize that that's not the substance of who we are. And we don't make that a barrier to people coming in. And so we've had some of that already happen, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, gosh, we're an experiment for this kind of stuff. Because people come here and from all over the country in pursuit of a job or something like that, and then they leave everything behind and they just create a new identity here. And part of that is not to be in church, and so it's a real challenge, here. Just surviving here is winning as a church, but we're not just to survive; we're actually to thrive, and. So that's what we want to explore, is how might we be on the cusp of that kind of life. So, hey, thanks for your attention. Thank you for that comment, and continue to share. That'll be great. All right, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rick.
See you next time.